Hey all, welcome back. I assume that you have now finished reading The Turn of the Screw so I can speak freely about anything that happens in the book. The ending was shocking. It's always shocking. I sort of always forget about it and then it shocks me every time I read the book again. Uh, Miles is dead. She seems to maybe have killed him at the end there. Insane. Okay, well, there's two things that I'd like to focus on in relation to the novel for this Friday follow-up video. And these are the same two things that I called your attention to in the last video, at the end of the last video. I want to talk about the question of the narrator's reliability, and I'd like to talk about the narrator's romantic slash erotic slash sexual inclinations, because this seems to be, to me, a crucial part of the book, and related, I think, to the question of reliability. But let's start with the question of the narrator's reliability. My sense is that we begin the novel trusting her impressions. She's already been vouched for in the prologue. Douglas is sort of in love with her, has nothing but nice things to say about her, so she seems like a reasonable person, someone we should admire. She then, when the actual story begins, she seems very thoughtful, very perceptive. So I think we trust her initially, but then, as the second half of the book unfolds, I think things become increasingly shaky in relation to her impressions and her general reliability. So yeah, and there's lots of evidence for this. I mean, if we take a look, some of the best evidence is the stuff I pointed you to in the perusal prompts. So if we take a look at this real quickly here, let's see. So this is the beginning, or the beginning of the first selection that I had. This is chapter 12. She's talking to Mrs. Gross. And she's talking, the two of them are sitting there, and the kids are walking arm in arm at a distance, and the governess is talking to Mrs. Gross about what she thinks is going on. She says, "I don't change, I simply make it out. The four depend on it," by which she means the two kids and the two ghosts. "The four depend on it, perpetually meet. If on either of these last nights you had been with either child, you could clearly have understood. The more I've watched and waited, the more I've felt that if there were nothing else to make it sure, it would be made so by the systematic silence of each. Never, by a slip of the tongue, have they so much as alluded to either of their old friends, the ghosts, any more than Miles has alluded to his expulsion. Oh yes, we may sit here and look at them, and they may show off to us to their fill, but even while they pretend to be lost in their fairy tale, they're steeped in their vision of the dead restored. He's not reading to her," I declared. "They're talking of them. They're talking horrors. I go on, I know, as if I were crazy, and it's a wonder I'm not. What I've seen would have made you so, but has only made me more lucid, made me get hold of still other things." So this is an interesting passage because to me, it's remarkable that the evidence that she finds is evidence of their silence. Like, she builds her whole case for the ghosts on the fact that the children are not talking about it. That seems kind of crazy to me. Right, my evidence, it's like, you're not talking about ghosts, so obviously you're thinking and talking about ghosts with other people, right? I mean, the silence itself, the emptiness, the lack of evidence is the evidence here. That seems something to me that ought to get our spidey sense tingling. And then I showed you a couple other quotes. She mentioned crazy in that passage. She mentions it here again. On the part of the little darlings, as yet more lovely babies. "Yes, mad as that seems," she says. So this language of craziness and madness comes into it here. I mean, I think the governess is certainly worried about how she's being perceived, so that makes sense. But I think the fact that that language bleeds into the text midway through suggests that maybe we ought to start thinking in those terms ourselves, that maybe we should be asking the question of just how reliable she is. Is the narrator crazy? So there's lots more evidence for this. Let's see. What else did I want to show you? Oh, I guess here, right. This is another remarkable passage I had you guys look at. She's talking again to Mrs. Gross, and she says, "Everything, it doesn't matter. I've made up my mind. I came home, my dear," I went on, "for a talk with Miss Jessel," right, the ghost, Miss Jessel, the former governess. "I had by this time formed the habit of having Mrs. Gross literally well in hand in advance of my sounding that note, so that even now, as she bravely blinked under the signal of my word, I could keep her comparatively firm. A talk?" This is Mrs. Gross. "A talk? Do you mean she spoke?" I'm with Mrs. Gross for a lot of this book. I'm kind of like, what are you talking about, crazy governess? But anyway, a talk. What do you mean? Did she speak? It came to that. I found her on my return in the schoolroom. And what did she say? I can hear the good woman still in the candor of her stupefaction. That phrase right there that the governess uses, it came to that. Right? We know, we've just seen the scene from the governess has just told us what happened in the scene. And Miss Jessel never spoke to her in the schoolroom. She doesn't say anything. She's sort of sad and that's it. So it came to that. She's essentially saying, I think, well, this is what she would have said if she did say something. It came to that. It meant the same thing. I mean, technically she didn't speak, but it came to that. And then she goes on to tell her what she imagines Miss Jessel to have said, despite the fact that Miss Jessel, the ghost, never talked. And what does she say? That she suffers the torments. It was this of a truth that made her, as she filled out my picture, gape. Do you mean, she faltered, of the lost? Of the lost, of the damned, and that's why, to share them, I faltered myself with the horror of it. But my companion, with less imagination, kept me up. To share them, she wants Flora. Mrs. Gross might, as I gave it to her, fairly have fallen away from me had I not been prepared. I still held her there to show I was. As I've told you, however, it doesn't matter. So this is a moment, or this is a scene, I think, in which the governess invents a conversation from the ghost to convince Miss Jessel. And she's inventing it based on what she believes was going on with the ghost. Again, there's a silence, and she's filling it with her own thoughts. So I think maybe, if we're alert to this kind of stuff, it asks us to call things into question. Okay? There's also, the moment, the more dramatic moment when she sees Mrs. Jessel across the water, and she points her out to Flora and says, look, there she is. There she is. And here's what happens in that scene, right? This is the way it plays out there. To see her, she's talking about Flora now. She's watching Flora's reaction. To see her, without a convulsion of her small pink face, not even feign to glance in the direction of the prodigy I announced, but only instead of that turn at me, an expression of hard, still gravity, an expression absolutely new and unprecedented, and that appeared to read and accuse and judge me. This was a stroke that somehow converted the little girl herself into a figure portentous. I gaped at her coolness, even though my certitude of her thoroughly seeing was never greater than at that instant. And then, in the immediate need to defend myself, I called her passionately to witness. She's there, you little unhappy thing. There, there, there. And you know it as well as you know me. So she says to little 6-year-old Flora, look, there's a ghost over there. And Flora's like, what? What are you talking about? And looks at her and sort of accuses her with this accusing look, like you're crazy. What are you, teasing me? And then she's like, you know she's there. You know she's there. You can see her. So again, this seems like a bit of craziness to me. It's much more understandable to me that Flora doesn't see anything, and she doesn't know why this grown-up is acting in this crazy way. So another piece of evidence, I think, and there's lots more in the text, that suggests we ought to take her as unreliable. So, I guess to make an obvious point, my interpretation is that all of this calls into question the reliability of the narrator. It seems quite possible to me that she's imagining these things and projecting her views onto the children. In short, she's crazy. The ghosts are not real. And thus, her craziness ends up killing Miles at the end, where I think she sort of crushes and smothers him, right, next to herself. However, all of that said, there are some complications to this reading. It's not all tied up in a neat bow. This is Henry James. That would never happen. This is one of his most ambiguous novels, right? So there are some things, I think, that conflict with this. At one point, right, Mrs. Gross admits that Flora has been using horrible language. She's been talking about all these naughty things that she must have learned from Quint or Jessel. So that suggests that Flora does remember and does know about Quint and Jessel. Or at least if it's not just a memory, then she perhaps is being visited by ghosts that are teaching her this bad language. Miles, too, does the same thing at the end, right? In the final climactic scene, he admits that he knows Miss Jessel and Quint. And it sounds even as if he's looking for them there. He's like, are they here? Are they here? Right? Which could be read as either he has a vivid memory of Quint and Jessel that he hasn't been telling the governess, or that he too has been visited by these ghosts. And there's more, right? If she's insane, for instance, we might ask, why does Douglas give such a positive review of her in that opening prologue? Right? There's no mention of her insanity. Why does she go on to be a governess for other children after the Bly house, right? Because Douglas knows her years and years later, and she's been a governess for years. if she was crazy, it seems like that would not have been allowed. Mrs. Gross ultimately says she believes the governess. And then there's the bit, right? I mean, how could the governess describe Quint in such detail to Mrs. Gross that first time? Describes him in such detail, red, curly hair, etc., that Mrs. Gross can identify him. I think none of these questions are unanswerable. I think there are counter arguments to them, but I wanted to lay them out there as some conflicting evidence with the narrator's crazy argument. Okay? Right, so evidence on both sides here, and I think you got to decide for yourself which is the most compelling. For me, I read her as unreliable and crazy. And the reason I do that is because I think it connects to another important subtext in the novel, right? Why, we might ask, has she gone crazy? Or better yet, maybe, what is the nature of her madness? And here, I think we get strong evidence that the governess is suffering from sexual repression. That is, I think, and I'm not alone here, there are a lot of readers of the book that read it this way, I think that her own sexual desires have been so tamped down and repressed that they are returning in uncanny ways. So the ghosts she sees are a key example, maybe, of Freud's return of the repressed. In this case, it's repressed sexual desire. And there is lots of evidence for this. So let me just run you through a little bit of it here. We mentioned this before, right, of the fact that when she first sees Quint, it's superimposed on this fantasy she's having of the uncle. She's daydreaming, she's walking around the castle daydreaming of the uncle, who I think she's attracted to, and then suddenly Quint's face appears where she was imagining the uncle's face. So there's a way in which the desire for the uncle becomes the desire for Quint, or there's a kind of confusion of the two things there. Okay. I think also her reaction anytime Mrs. Gross talks about contacting the uncle, she's absolutely determined not to call the uncle because I think she doesn't want to disappoint him. She doesn't want to go against his wishes and make him unhappy. And she doesn't because I think she's so attracted to him and wants him to think well of her. Okay, but the real evidence, I think, starts coming later in the book. There's the scene in which we already referred to it, but the scene in which she is doubled, I think, with Miss Jessel in the schoolroom. Okay, so this is right at the end of chapter 15, if I back it up a little bit here. So take a look at this passage, right? Again, this is a passage, there's a couple of times in the novel in which I think we see Miss Jessel and the governess doubled. I mean, the obvious one is that she's the previous governess, so it's two governesses, right? But also it seems to me that Miss Jessel exhibits some of the sexual desire that our narrator also has, but is not willing to admit. So there's this strange scene when they encounter each other in the schoolroom. And listen to this. Seated at my own table in clear noonday light, I saw a person whom, without my previous experience, I should have taken at the first blush for some housemaid who might have stayed at home to look after the place, and who, availing herself of rare relief from observation and of the schoolroom table and my pens, ink, and paper, had applied herself to the considerable effort of a letter to her sweetheart. I mean, okay, so already we have Miss Jessel writing a letter to her sweetheart, which is, of course, what the governess has been doing. She's been writing a letter to the uncle. There was an effort in the way that, while her arms rested on the table, her hands with evident weariness supported her head. But at the moment I took this in, I had already become aware that, in spite of my entrance, her attitude strangely persisted. Then it was, with the very act of its announcing itself, that her identity flared up in a change of posture. She rose, not as if she had heard me, but with an indescribable grand melancholy of indifference and detachment, and within a dozen feet of me stood there as my vile predecessor. Right, so this is the moment the governess recognizes her as Miss Jessel. Dishonored and tragic, she was all before me. But even as I fixed and, for memory, secured it, the awful image passed away. Dark as midnight in her black dress, her haggard beauty and her unutterable woe, she had looked at me long enough to appear to say that her right to sit at my table was as good as mine to sit at hers. Again, we get the doubling, right? They both have rights. They're both sitting at tables. While these instants lasted, indeed, I had the extraordinary chill of feeling that it was I who was the intruder. It was as a wild protest against it that, actually addressing her, "You terrible, miserable woman," I heard myself break into a sound that by the open door rang through the long passages in the empty house. She looked at me as if she heard me, but I had recovered myself and cleared the air. There was nothing in the room the next minute but the sunshine and a sense that I must stay. Right? So there's a doubling. Who has the right to be here? She feels like she's the intruder, like the positions have been reversed. This is a clear scene of doubling, it seems to me. And so the close connection here, I think, with Miss Jessel suggests that as her double, the governess, the narrator, she too has these desires that Miss Jessel gave her life for. Right? I mean, Miss Jessel, we have to remember, is a victim of forbidden desire. She sleeps with Quint, and then she gets pregnant. And this, at some level, is something that the governess herself really wants and is really attracted to. But of course, she cannot allow herself to do that because it's, socially frowned upon. Well, it's not socially, it's socially prohibited, right? You'd be an outcast if you do that. And I think the fact that the governess is so bothered here, right? You terrible, miserable woman, she shouts. I think the fact she's so upset by this and really, really bothered by it suggests how deeply these feelings and these connections connect with her, right? That's a kind of measure of the anger, the fury with which she responds. If it was no big deal, she didn't really care that much about it, she wouldn't get so angry. Okay, so this as more evidence, I think, of the repressed desire of the governess. A couple more. I'll just turn you real quickly to the scenes in the bedroom with Miles. Let's see if I can get this back up here. Okay, yeah. I just take a look at this. I mean, I'm guessing that you sort of picked up on what seems to me the thinly veiled erotic subtext of this. I mean, I think it's interesting at the very beginning of the chapter, right? She's starting to write the letter to the uncle. I sat for a long time before a blank sheet of paper and listened to the lash of the rain and the batter of the gusts. Finally, I went out, taking a candle. I crossed the passage and listened a minute at Miles's door. So she's working on this letter to the person that she's attracted to, and then she gets up and she heads over to Miles' door, right? It's as if, again, she's transferring that desire in some way. And then, of course, he's awake. She's like, what are you doing here? What do you think of? What in the world, my dear, but you? Right? So there's this really strange back and forth dynamic between the two of them that seems to me to be erotically charged in a really creepy kind of way. But if we go down a little bit further here, it struck me that he faintly colored. Right? He blushes. He gave, at any rate, like a convalescent, slightly fatigued, a languid shake of his head. I want to get away. You're tired of Bly? Oh no, I like Bly. Well then, oh, you know what a boy wants. It was a bizarre line to me, also creepy. I felt that I didn't know so well as Miles, and I took temporary refuge. You want to go to your uncle? And then this, I don't know, this is an odd exchange to me. And again at this, with his sweet, ironic face, he made a movement on the pillow. You can't get off with that. I was silent a little, and it was I now, I think, who changed color. My dear, I don't want to get off. You can't even if you do. So the back and forth, the use of the language "get off" too, right? I mean, there's a sexual charge to that phrasing too. I'm not 100% sure it's being used in that sense here. This is written, the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. I did go to the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, and look up the history of the word, of the phrase "get off." Right? We know it as to have a sexual connotation right now, and I was wondering when that started. Let me just show you what I found here real quickly, if I can pull it up. Yeah, so the Oxford English Dictionary is the best English dictionary in the world, right? It gives you the history of words and the etymology of words. So if we go here to get, and then I do a little search for the phrase "get off." Okay. So this takes us down in here. Get off your backside and do something. To get lost. Get off means to get lost. But if we go down here a little bit, you see slang, euphemistic, chiefly British and Australian, to get off. To get off at Edge Hill, to engage in coitus interruptus, to withdraw the penis from the vagina before ejaculation. So there's a sexual connotation. I saw this and I thought, okay, so James could be using this. But then I looked at the dates, the examples they give, and the earliest one is 1967, which is obviously long after James wrote this. So I thought, this doesn't really work. The sexual connotation of that phrase, "get off," doesn't work. But I kept looking because I'm, if not persistent. Okay, so further down here, we find intransitive slang originally in the U.S. So to get one's rocks off, etc., etc. to achieve sexual satisfaction, to experience an orgasm. And the earliest use of this is 1867. So, if you go through this etymology, you find other hints that there are sexual connotations to that phrase "get off" that happened earlier in the 19th century and even before that. So I think it's possible that James is playing around with this here and this charged exchange between the two of them. I don't know. You don't have to pin a lot on that. That's just a detail that jumped out at me. I think there's plenty of other evidence to go along with this. Maybe one of the best pieces, I think, happens at the end of chapter 22. I'll read you the passage here, the end of chapter 22. This is when the governess and Miles have been left alone at the house. Everybody else has left. We're almost at the final scene of the book. But just this description at the very end of chapter 22. While this was done, Miles stood again with his hands in his little pockets and his back to me, stood and looked out of the wide window through which, that other day, I had seen what pulled me up. We continued, and that was Quint that she saw through the same window. We continued silent while the maid was with us. As silent, it whimsically occurred to me, as some young couple who, on their wedding journey at the inn, feel shy in the presence of the waiter. He turned around only when the waiter had left us. Well, so we're alone. So she imagines them as a young married couple, right? Sort of embarrassed with each other, but yeah, newlyweds. So another clue, I think, that the dynamic with Miles in particular is one that is charged with these erotic undertones. And then, of course, there's the dramatic ending of the book in which she kind of comes out with how much she cares for him and how much she wants to possess him, so much so that it kills him. So, I guess I'll wrap it up there. There's lots of evidence for this in the text, but I guess from this perspective, the governess's sexual repression manifests itself in these visions of ghosts. Ghosts who had a love affair of the sort that she desperately wants at some level, perhaps unconsciously, but she desperately wants it, but she can't have it because society doesn't permit it. So in this way, the horror story here, the horror fiction, allows us to explore the dangers and consequences of psychological and sexual repression. It's not unlike what we saw in Psycho, right, in his relationship with his mother, the repression that seemed to be in place there. Horror, again, highlights for us, I think, in this book, a fascinating aspect of the human psyche. And if we want to make that other move, if we want to ask how this might apply to the larger cultural context, right, outside of the text, what might it imply about the larger world at this time, at the time that it was written, we might argue that the book is about the dangers of sexual repression in late 19th century Victorian society, right? Victorian society in England and America was notoriously buttoned up. Couldn't talk about sex, no sex. That's totally improper, right? So everything is just hidden, tamped down, repressed. And so this book suggests maybe that there are some ways in which that kind of repression is dangerous and bubbles up in scary, uncanny ways. All right, well, I'll wrap it up there, but in case you think I'm the only one weird enough to interpret the book in this way, I'm going to close with a scene from a 1961 film version of the book. The film's entitled The Innocents, and it follows the book fairly closely. But you'll see that the filmmakers were very attuned to the sexual subtext running throughout the novel. So check it out.
Come on, I'll tell you when I'm in bed. Well, now.
Yes?
I wanted you to think me bad for a change.
For a change?
Well, I thought I might be becoming a bore.
Miles, tell me the truth.
I am. I mean, good children do get a bit boring, don't they? So I thought, why not go out tonight and wander about in my bare feet? Which was a shocking thing to do, wasn't it?
Yes, very shocking.
Well, that was our plan. Flora and I arranged it together. But we giggled so. I was sure you must have heard us.
Yes, I did hear something.
I told her to go over to the window. Then you'd be bound to look out and see me. Flora's been bad as well.
Miles, what are you hiding under your pillow?
I'm not hiding it. I'm keeping it warm. I found it this morning. One of my pigeons. I couldn't, could I, leave it out there alone?
But, Miles, its neck. It looks as though...
Someone had broken it. Yes, poor thing. I'll bury it tomorrow. Kiss me good night, Miss Giddens.